Hey, North Metro. Thank you so much for joining us again today for our Holy Week devotionals. We actually hope this is actually helping you to keep Jesus as a focus this week as we walk towards Resurrection Sunday. Now, in the church calendar, today is normally referred to as Maundy Thursday. And you may be thinking, Maundy Thursday, what in the world does that even mean, right? Great question. The word Maundy, M-A-U-N-D-Y, is a word derived from the Latin mandatum, which means commandment. It's like the word mandate. It refers to us when Jesus was in the upper room at the Last Supper, and he gives his disciples a new commandment, which is, in my humble opinion, the most important event that actually happened on that Thursday of Holy Week. We're going to check it out here in Mark's Gospel, chapter 14, verse 12. And on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Now, of course, listen, the Passover, it's the annual celebration on where the Hebrew people, right, they remember how God, as part of his rescue effort to free the Jews from slavery in Egypt, how he actually sent the messenger of death, or the angel of death, over Egypt. And he instructed Moses and the Hebrew people to sacrifice a lamb and basically paint their doorpost with the blood. What this would do was, it was simply to signify to the messenger of death to pass over their house, sparing them from that death. Well, not too long after that, of course, God rescued them from the clutches of Pharaoh of Egypt. And eventually, as we've been learning in our Jesus is Better study in Hebrews, God would initiate the Mosaic covenant, which included the giving of the over 600 plus laws, and which also included the 10 Commandments. And so in the Gospel of Mark, we actually have Jesus and his disciples gathered in the upper room of someone else's house, about to remember and about to celebrate the Passover. Now, here's where you have this tragic moment where Jesus reveals that Judas is going to betray him, which can we just acknowledge how awkward that must have been for the other disciples in that moment? Like, awkward, but I digress. And then Jesus says something that would actually change everything. It would also initiate a ritual that we, of course, still practice today in our churches. Let's take a look at it in verse 22. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them. And he said, "This is my body." And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank it. And he said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it anew in the kingdom of God." So here's the thing. These guys have grown up celebrating the Passover. This was old hat for them, right? This was something they knew backwards and forwards, right? They knew the stories of Moses that would be recounted year after year. They knew the prayers that they would recite every single year. They knew it. It was wired into their memory, North Metro. But then Jesus says something that had to stop them in their tracks. Like, one of the other gospel writers describes the situation in the upper room as the disciples were reclining by the table as they ate the Passover meal, right? They're chilling, they're relaxing, they're hanging out. But then Jesus goes and drops the word diatheke. It's the Greek word for covenant. And so whatever chilling or reclining was happening at the moment, it stopped. Every one of them probably actually sat up straight, and they stared at Jesus as if he was a ghost, because not only did Jesus say the word covenant, he said new covenant. God gave Moses and the Hebrew people the covenant. There was no old covenant. There was only the covenant, period. But now, here is Jesus, who had been talking about betrayal and sacrifice and his own death, and now here he is talking about his body being broken and his blood being shed, initiating a new covenant. And if I had to guess, all of their thoughts rushed back to what God did even before Moses. If I had to guess, their thoughts rushed all the way back to Abraham. I want to jump back into Genesis 15 as we take a look at this. So God is forming a covenant with Abram. Okay, he's making promises to Abram, saying, "Hey," Abram's like, "I don't have an heir. I guess, Eleazar of Damascus will be my disciple, my heir. He lives in my house." And God says, "Nope, you're actually going to have your own son who will be your heir. As a matter of fact, your descendants will be like as numbered as many as the stars in the sky." And Abraham goes, "I believe him." And that's where you have that passage or that verse where it says, Abram believed God and God credited it to him as righteousness. But then right on the heels of that, Abram goes, okay, so how do I really know that you're going to make good on this, right? How do I really, really know? And so what God does, he goes, hold on. Here's how. He said to him, he says in verse 9 of chapter 15, bring me a heifer 3 years old, a female goat 3 years old, a ram 3 years old, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. And he brought them, all of these, and he cut them in half, and he laid them out. But he did not cut the birds in half. And when the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, he drove them away. It's kind of a weird thing. But here's the thing. Verse 12, as the sun was going down, a deep sleep fell on Abram. And God begins to give him the stipulations of this covenant. And so what's happening in this moment, God is borrowing an ancient Near Eastern form known as covenant. Meaning God didn't invent the covenant, not in this situation. Like this was being practiced all the time between people. And so when you talk about a covenant, it's the Hebrew word berit, and it means to cut. You cut a covenant, hence the cutting of the animals. And what would happen is that usually this happened on like a hillside. And so what you would do is you would place the pieces on the left and the right, and I know it's gross, but their blood would drip down and it would form what's known as a blood path. And so usually what you have is a parity form of covenant. That's where two people of equal value, if you will, equal standing, say, hey, we're forming a covenant with one another, and here are the stipulations of our covenant. And then both parties would walk back and forth in the blood path. I know it's disgusting, but they were walking back and forth in the blood path, and they would recite the stipulations of their covenant. As to say, if one of us breaks this covenant, this is what happens to us, right? The death that they see all around them. And so we actually have a common form of that now. Have you ever thought about when you've been at a wedding? Why is there a groom's side? Why is there a bride's side? Covenant. Why do you walk down the aisle, recite the stipulations of your covenant, and then walk down the aisle? Covenant. Why do you cut the cake? It's all covenant. It's all covenant, right? So that's a typical covenant. But then on rare occurrences, you would have a suzerain-vassal relationship. You'd have a suzerain-vassal covenant. A suzerain is the stronger party, and the vassal is the weaker party. So just for example, if the United States forms a covenant with Puerto Rico, the United States is huge, Puerto Rico is small. In this moment, everyone is acutely aware the U.S. is the suzerain, Puerto Rico is the vassal. So if the U.S. said, hey, we're going to form a covenant with you, and if we ever go to war, you have to fight for us. Well, Puerto Rico knows, hey, I have to do this. Why? Because they're the bigger party, right? They'll take us out. And so here's this moment where God's forming a covenant with Abram. And Abram is acutely aware of who the suzerain is and who the vassal is. God is the suzerain, Abram is the vassal. And Abram knows, I know it's going to happen. I know it's going to happen. You're going to ask me to walk between the pieces in the blood path, and I'm going to recite the stipulations of this covenant as to say if I break it or if my descendants break it, because later on, as God adds more to the covenant, it just gets brought into the overarching covenant that God has with his people. He's going to say, yeah, I know if me or my descendants, if we break any form of the covenant we form with you, this is what happens to us. I get it, right? But then God puts Abram to sleep. And he talks about the covenant, but then here's what happens. Verse 17. When the sun had gone down and it was dark, behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between these pieces. On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, or with Abram at that time. And here's what's happening. Like I said, usually it would be Abram, the vassal, who would walk between the pieces, reciting the stipulations of the covenant, saying, hey, I know if I break it, my descendants break it, this is what happens to me or them or us. But that's not what happened. That smoking fire pot and flaming torch was symbolic of who God was. And so in this uncanny, unreal, mind-blowing moment, you have the suzerain, not the vassal, who's walking between the pieces in the blood path, saying, Abram, if you or your descendants break this covenant, this is what happens to me. And so let's fast forward back into that upper room where Jesus and his disciples are having that Passover meal, and Jesus just drops the word covenant. Here's what the disciples are acutely aware of. God is about to make good on his covenant. He's about to make good on his promises. Because we all know for years and years and years and years, none of us have kept that covenant perfectly. And now we see what God meant. That God would send his son to die on the cross to say, because you have broken this covenant, my people, this is what happens to me. And so as we approach Good Friday tomorrow, and even as we take communion as a church, family online, if we can do this together, hopefully you'll join us, find your crackers and juice or whatever you have to do that with us tomorrow night. We'll be remembering not just the sacrifice of Jesus, but also the kindness and the goodness and the sovereignty and the kingliness and the fatherness of God, that he always makes good on his promises, that God can be trusted in beautiful ways, and it is most beautifully seen on the Father sending the Son to die for our sins. God always keeps his promises, North Metro, and may we celebrate, because here's the reality, right? The tomb is empty. Resurrection Sunday is coming, and I really hope that you will log in with us. You'll sync up with, you'll tune in with us online with us. And listen, what an amazing opportunity to send a link. Like right now, if you're thinking about, text some friends. Hey, join us, live.northmetro.org. Man, Sunday morning is going to be great. 7 o'clock is a sunrise service, 9:30 and 11:30. Maybe you create a watch party on Facebook and say, hey, send them the link, say, join us, watch with us. It's an incredibly easy way to do that. But we're going to celebrate because the grave is empty, right? Because in that, as we've been saying, and Jesus doesn't just take us to the grave, he takes us through the grave, and he modeled that and says he'll take us with him. And so let us continue to worship and be grateful for the God who keeps his promises. North Metro, I love you, and I can't wait to see you.